The morning had started like any other for Officer Trent Holloway. Coffee from the same gas station he always stopped at. The same route through town with the windows cracked just enough to let the early autumn air slip through. And in the back of his patrol SUV, the same steady presence he'd trusted with his life for the past 4 years, his canine partner, a Belgian Malinois named Briggs. The dog sat upright in his compartment, ears forward, eyes scanning the world through the mesh barrier like he was cataloging every shadow and every scent that passed by. Briggs was 7 years old now, seasoned and sharp, with a reputation in the department for being one of the most reliable detection dogs they'd ever trained. He'd found narcotics hidden in engine blocks. He tracked fleeing suspects through rain-soaked woods. He'd even alerted on a concealed weapon during a routine traffic stop that had almost certainly saved Trent's life. But nothing Briggs had ever done, nothing in all those years of service had prepared Trent for what was about to happen outside Ridgemont Elementary. The school visit was supposed to be simple. A community outreach event. Something to show the kids that police officers were helpers, not people to fear. Trent had done dozens of these over the years, and he actually enjoyed them. The kids always loved Briggs. They'd crowd around with wide eyes and outstretched hands, asking if the dog could do tricks or if he'd ever caught a bad guy. Trent would demonstrate a few basic commands, let Briggs show off his obedience, and then answer questions while the teachers handed out plastic badge stickers. It was easy. It was good for the community. And it gave Briggs a chance to interact with civilians in a calm, controlled environment, which was important for keeping his social instincts balanced. Today was supposed to be no different. The principal had arranged for the K-9 demonstration to happen on the blacktop near the playground, right after morning announcements. Parents had been invited to watch. A few local reporters were even supposed to stop by for a quick photo op. Everything was set up and ready by the time Trent pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine. He sat there for a moment, just breathing. The school looked peaceful in the soft morning light. Yellow buses were still unloading near the front entrance, and clusters of kids moved in chaotic little streams toward the doors. Teachers stood at crosswalks with reflective vests and clipboards. A few parents lingered near the pickup loop, chatting and sipping from travel mugs. It all looked so normal, so safe. Trent reached back and unlatched the compartment door, and Briggs hopped down onto the asphalt with practiced ease, his nails clicking against the pavement. He wore his working vest, the one with the department patch, and the bold letters that read K-9 Unit, Do Not Pet. Trent clipped the lead to his collar and gave him a quick scratch behind the ears. "All right, buddy," he murmured. "Let's go make some friends." Briggs didn't wag his tail. He didn't pant or pull at the leash. He just stood there, perfectly still, his head turned slightly toward the playground. Trent frowned. That was unusual. Briggs was always alert, always professional, but he typically showed at least a flicker of interest when they arrived somewhere new. Right now, though, the dog's entire body had gone rigid. His ears were pinned forward so hard they almost touched at the tips. His nostrils flared in quick, shallow pulses. And his eyes were locked onto something across the schoolyard, something Trent couldn't immediately identify. "Briggs," Trent said, giving the lead a gentle tug. "Heel." The dog didn't move. He didn't even blink. His muscles were coiled tight beneath his fur, and a low, barely audible whine escaped his throat. Not a sound of aggression. Not a warning bark. Something softer. Something that made the hairs on Trent's arms stand up. He followed the dog's gaze across the blacktop, past the swing sets, past the groups of laughing children, past the teachers with their clipboards and their cheerful waves. And then he saw her. A little girl, sitting alone on a wooden bench near the far edge of the playground. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. She wore a faded pink hoodie that looked at least a size too big, and she was hunched forward with her elbows on her knees, staring at the ground. A worn backpack sat beside her, the straps frayed and the zipper half broken. She wasn't playing. She wasn't talking to anyone. She wasn't even watching the other kids. She was just sitting there, still as a statue. And she hadn't looked up once, since Trent had arrived. Briggs took a step toward her, then another. His body was low, his movement slow and deliberate, like he was approaching something fragile, something that might shatter if he moved too fast. Trent felt his heart rate climb. He'd seen Briggs work hundreds of times. He knew what a drug alert looked like. He knew what a weapon alert looked like. This wasn't either of those. This was something else entirely. Something Trent had never seen before. "Briggs, come," he said, more firmly this time. The dog ignored him completely. He kept walking toward the girl, pulling the lead taut, his eyes never leaving her. A few parents nearby had started to notice. One of them stepped back nervously, pulling her own child closer. A teacher near the entrance called out, asking if everything was okay. Trent raised a hand to signal that things were under control, even though he wasn't entirely sure they were. Briggs reached the edge of the bench and stopped. He didn't bark. He didn't paw at the girl or try to get her attention. He simply sat down, right there in front of her. And he stayed. His head tilted slightly to one side, his ears softening, his posture shifting into something almost protective. The girl finally looked up. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She stared at the dog for a long moment, her lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. And then, slowly, she reached out one small hand and placed it on top of Briggs' head. Trent felt his chest tighten. He didn't know what he was looking at yet. He didn't understand what Briggs had sensed, or why the dog had refused every command to break focus. But something deep in his gut told him that this wasn't a coincidence. That this little girl, this quiet, invisible child sitting alone on a bench while the rest of the world rushed by, was exactly where Briggs needed to be. He crouched down a few feet away, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "Hey there," he said softly. "My name's Officer Holloway. This is Briggs. He's my partner." The girl didn't answer. She didn't even look at Trent. But her hand stayed on the dog's head, her fingers curling gently into his fur. Her other hand was tucked tight against her body, pressed into the folds of her too-big hoodie like she was trying to hide something, or protect something. Trent glanced at her backpack. It was old and worn, held together in places by duct tape and safety pins. There was a small tear near the bottom where something sharp had ripped through the fabric. And there, just barely visible beneath her sleeve, was a bruise. Dark and mottled, yellow at the edges. The kind of bruise that didn't come from a fall on the playground. Trent's blood ran cold. He kept his expression calm, his voice steady, but inside, every instinct he had was screaming. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward him for just a second, then back down to Briggs. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "Sadie," Trent nodded slowly. "That's a pretty name, Sadie. Is it okay if I sit here with you for a minute?" She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. She just kept petting Briggs, her small fingers trembling slightly against his fur, and the dog didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, his warm brown eyes fixed on the little girl's face, like he was telling her something without words. Like he was saying, "I see you. I'm not going anywhere." Trent shifted his weight, settling onto the edge of the bench a few feet from Sadie. He kept his body angled toward her, but not facing her directly, giving her space without making her feel cornered. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting long shadows across the blacktop, and the sounds of children playing seemed to fade into the background like distant music. All that mattered in this moment was the little girl in front of him, and the dog who refused to leave her side. "Briggs really likes you," Trent said quietly. "He doesn't sit like that for just anyone, you know." Sadie's fingers paused in the dog's fur. She didn't respond, but her shoulders tensed slightly, like she was bracing for something. Trent recognized that posture. He'd seen it before in witnesses who had been through trauma, in victims who expected the next question to be the one that finally broke them open. He chose his next words carefully. "You're not in trouble, Sadie. I promise. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." She still wouldn't look at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on Briggs, on the steady rise and fall of his breathing, on the warmth of his presence against her knees. But her lip trembled. Just slightly. Just enough for Trent to notice. "Is everything all right at home?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle. The question hung in the air between them. Sadie's hands stopped moving entirely. Her whole body went rigid, and for a moment Trent thought she might bolt. He could see the fear rippling through her like a current, tightening her muscles, quickening her breath. Briggs let out a soft whine and pressed his head more firmly against her leg, grounding her. The girl's eyes squeezed shut. A single tear slipped down her cheek, carving a clean line through the faint smudge of dirt on her face. "I don't want to go home," she whispered. The words were so quiet that Trent almost missed them. But he didn't miss them. He heard every syllable, and they hit him like a punch to the chest. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. He couldn't push too hard. Not yet. But he also couldn't walk away. Not when every instinct he had was telling him that this child was in danger. "Can you tell me why?" he asked softly. Sadie shook her head, her eyes still closed. Her fingers had curled into Briggs' fur so tightly that her knuckles were white. She was holding onto the dog like he was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. "Is someone hurting you, Sadie?" Trent asked. He kept his voice low, his words measured. He didn't want to scare her. He didn't want to make her shut down. But he needed to know. She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Her silence was answer enough. Trent reached for his radio, his movements slow and deliberate. He pressed the button and spoke quietly, requesting the school counselor to meet him at the playground bench near the east fence. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. The tone of his voice said everything. A few minutes later, a woman with graying hair and kind eyes appeared at the edge of the blacktop. Her name tag read Ms. Delgado, and she moved with the careful precision of someone who had dealt with situations like this before. She approached slowly, her expression calm but alert, and stopped a few feet away when she saw Sadie. "Officer Holloway?" she asked quietly. Trent nodded and gestured for her to come closer. He introduced her to Sadie, explaining that Miss Delgado was someone who helped kids when they were feeling scared or confused. Someone safe. Sadie barely acknowledged the counselor. Her focus remained locked on Briggs, her small hand still resting on his head like it was the only anchor she had in the world. But when Ms. Delgado crouched down beside her and spoke in a soft, unhurried voice, something shifted. The counselor didn't ask questions right away. She didn't pry or push. She simply sat there, present and patient, letting the silence stretch until Sadie was ready to fill it. It took nearly 10 minutes. 10 minutes of quiet waiting, of gentle reassurances, of Briggs pressing his warm body against the little girl's legs like he was shielding her from something invisible. And then, finally, Sadie spoke. "He hits me," she said. Her voice was barely audible, cracked and broken at the edges. "Mommy's boyfriend. He gets mad when I make noise. Or when I eat too much. Or when I don't clean up fast enough." She pulled her sleeve back, revealing the bruise Trent had glimpsed earlier. But it wasn't alone. There were others. A row of them climbing up her forearm like dark fingerprints burned into her skin. Trent's jaw tightened. He forced Ezekiel himself to stay calm, to keep his expression neutral, but inside he felt a rage building that he hadn't experienced in years. Ms. Delgado's face had gone pale. She reached out and gently touched Sadie's shoulder, her voice trembling slightly as she asked how long this had been happening. "Since summer," Sadie whispered. "Mommy doesn't know. She's always at work. And he said if I told anyone, he'd hurt her too." The weight of those words settled over them like a shroud. Trent could feel the fury coiling in his chest, hot and sharp, but he buried it deep. This wasn't the time for anger. This was the time for action. He excused himself for a moment and stepped away, pulling out his phone. His first call was to dispatch, requesting a Child Protective Services liaison be sent to the school immediately. His second call was to Detective Mariana Cross, a colleague he trusted implicitly when it came to cases involving minors. He explained the situation in clipped, careful sentences, keeping his voice low so Sadie wouldn't overhear. Cross listened without interrupting. When Trent finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she said 3 words that told him everything he needed to know. "I'm on my way." By the time Cross arrived, the school had quietly shifted into a different mode. The K-9 demonstration had been postponed. Parents had been ushered toward the front parking lot with vague explanations about a scheduling conflict. Teachers had corralled the children into classrooms, keeping them occupied with impromptu activities while the adults dealt with the situation unfolding near the playground. Sadie had been moved to the counselor's office, a small room with soft chairs and colorful posters on the walls. Briggs went with her. Trent had tried to call him back, to give the girl space, but the dog had simply looked at him with those steady brown eyes and refused to budge. So Trent let him stay. Detective Cross conducted the interview with a gentleness that belied her usual no-nonsense demeanor. She sat across from Sadie, her notepad resting on her knee, and asked questions in a way that felt more like a conversation than an interrogation. She let Sadie set the pace. She let her pause when she needed to. She let her cry when the words became too heavy to hold. And through it all, Briggs stayed pressed against Sadie's side, his head resting on her lap, his presence a silent promise that she wasn't alone. The story that emerged was heartbreaking. Sadie's mother worked double shifts at a warehouse across town. She'd started dating a man named Ray Combs about 8 months ago, and he'd moved in shortly after. At first he'd seemed nice, but then the drinking started, and then the anger, and then the hitting. Ray had been careful. He never left marks where teachers or doctors might see them. He targeted Sadie's arms, her back, her ribs, places hidden by clothing. He told her that no one would believe her if she spoke up, that her mother would hate her for ruining their family, that she'd end up in foster care, alone and forgotten, if she said a single word. So Sadie had stayed silent. For months, she had carried the weight of that secret, coming to school with fresh bruises hidden beneath oversized hoodies, flinching at loud noises, avoiding eye contact with adults who might look too closely. She had become invisible, and no one had noticed. Until today. Until a dog named Briggs had walked across a playground and sat down in front of her, like he'd known all along that she needed saving. The hours that followed moved in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and hushed conversations in hallways. Trent stayed at the school far longer than he'd planned, watching from the edges as the machinery of child protection slowly ground into motion. Detective Cross coordinated with the district's Family Services Unit, arranging for an emergency home assessment and a forensic interview at the Children's Advocacy Center downtown. A social worker named Patricia Vance arrived around noon, a calm woman with reading glasses perched on her nose and a weathered leather bag slung over one shoulder. She spent nearly an hour with Sadie, her voice soft and measured, asking the same questions in different ways to build a complete picture of what the girl had endured. Trent couldn't sit still. He paced the hallway outside the counselor's office, checking his phone, glancing at the closed door, replaying every detail of the morning in his mind. He kept thinking about the moment Briggs had first locked onto Sadie, that strange, deliberate focus that had defied every command. The dog had known. Somehow, in a way that Trent couldn't explain and probably never would, Briggs had sensed that something was terribly wrong with that little girl, and he had refused to let it go unnoticed. By mid-afternoon, the pieces had come together. Patricia Vance had gathered enough preliminary evidence to justify an emergency removal order. Detective Cross had obtained a warrant, and a patrol unit had been dispatched to the address on file for Sadie's mother, a small rental house on the south side of town where Ray Combs was likely to be found. Trent asked to be part of the team. Cross hesitated for a moment, studying his face with those sharp, assessing eyes of hers. Then she nodded. "Stay in the car until we've secured the scene," she said. "I don't want any complications," Trent agreed, but he brought Briggs anyway. The dog had earned the right to see this through. The house was exactly what Trent had pictured. Peeling paint on the siding, A patchy lawn dotted with weeds and scattered beer cans. Blinds drawn tight against the afternoon sun. A rusted pickup truck sat in the driveway, its tailgate hanging open and a crumpled tarp draped over something in the bed. The whole place felt neglected, forgotten, like the kind of home where bad things happened and no one ever bothered to ask questions. 3 patrol cars converged on the street, their lights off, but engines idling. Cross led the approach, flanked by 2 uniformed officers with hands resting on their sidearms. Trent stayed back near his SUV, watching through the windshield as they moved up the cracked concrete walkway and positioned themselves on either side of the front door. The knock was firm, authoritative. Cross announced herself as police and waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door swung open, and a man appeared in the frame. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and bloodshot eyes that squinted against the light. He was holding a beer can in one hand and wore a stained undershirt stretched tight across his gut. His expression shifted from confusion to irritation in the span of a heartbeat. "The hell do you want?" he growled. Cross didn't flinch. She held up the warrant and explained, in clipped professional tones, that they were there regarding allegations of child abuse. Ray Combs' face went pale, then red, then a shade of fury that made Trent's hand drift instinctively toward his holster. What happened next was fast. Ray threw the beer can at Cross and tried to slam the door, but one of the officers was quicker. He jammed his boot into the gap and shoved the door back open, sending Ray stumbling into the cluttered living room. There was shouting, a brief struggle, the sound of furniture scraping across a floor, and then silence. When Trent finally stepped out of the SUV and approached the house, Ray Combs was face down on the carpet with his hands cuffed behind his back, cursing into the fibers while an officer read him his rights. Cross stood over him, her expression hard as granite, her notepad still clutched in one hand like she hadn't even had time to put it away. "Ray Combs," she said flatly, "you're under arrest for felony child abuse. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words washed over Trent like a wave of cold relief. He stood in the doorway and let himself breathe for the first time in hours. It was over. The man who had terrorized a 7-year-old girl for months, who had made her believe she was invisible, worthless, alone, was being dragged out of his own home in handcuffs. And he would never touch Sadie again. The aftermath was quieter, but no less important. Sadie's mother, a woman named Denise, was contacted at her workplace and brought to the school. She arrived looking confused and frightened, her work uniform still dusty from the warehouse floor. When she learned what had been happening to her daughter, what had been happening under her own roof while she was away, she collapsed into a chair and wept. She hadn't known. She swore she hadn't known. And looking into her devastated eyes, Trent believed her. Ray had been manipulating both of them, isolating Sadie, keeping the abuse hidden behind closed doors and threats of worse to come. Denise wasn't allowed to take Sadie home that night. The house was considered an unsafe environment pending further investigation, and there were still questions about whether she had been complicit or simply oblivious. But family services had located a relative willing to step in immediately. Sadie's maternal grandmother, a retired schoolteacher named Elaine who lived 2 towns over. She arrived at the school within hours, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and her eyes red from crying. She wrapped Sadie in her arms and held her for a long time, whispering promises that everything was going to be okay now, that she was safe, that she would never have to go back to that house again. Trent watched from across the room, Briggs sitting quietly at his side. The dog's ears were relaxed for the first time all day, his posture loose and calm like he finally understood that his work was done. Sadie glanced over her grandmother's shoulder and met Trent's eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. But something in her expression shifted. A flicker of gratitude, perhaps, or the faint beginnings of relief. Then she buried her face in her grandmother's shoulder and let herself be held. 3 weeks passed. The case against Ray Combs moved through the system with unusual speed. bolstered by Sadie's testimony and the physical evidence documented during her forensic exam. He was denied bail and awaited trial in county lockup, facing multiple felony charges that would likely keep him behind bars for years. Denise had entered counseling and was working with social services to rebuild her life and prove that she could provide a safe home for her daughter. It would be a long road, but there was hope. Trent had almost forgotten about the school visit until the call came in. The principal at Ridgemont Elementary wanted to arrange something special, a chance for Sadie to thank the officer and the dog who had changed her life. Trent hesitated at first. He wasn't comfortable with praise or recognition, but when the principal explained that Sadie had asked for it herself, that she had specifically requested to see Briggs again, he couldn't say no. The meeting took place on a Saturday morning, in the same playground where everything had begun. The swings were empty. The blacktop was quiet, and Sadie stood near the wooden bench where she had once sat alone, her grandmother beside her, her small hand clutching a folded piece of paper. She looked different now. Her cheeks had more color. Her eyes were brighter. She wore a new jacket that actually fit, and her hair was pulled back in two neat braids tied with purple ribbons. Trent walked toward her with Briggs at his side, the dog's tail wagging gently for the first time in weeks. When they reached the bench, Sadie crouched down and wrapped her arms around Briggs' neck, pressing her face into his fur. The dog stood perfectly still, his eyes half closed, his whole body radiating a kind of quiet contentment that Trent had never seen in him before. "Thank you," Sadie whispered. She pulled back and looked up at Trent, her eyes glistening but steady. "Thank you for believing me." Trent knelt down so he was at her level. "You're the brave one, Sadie," he said softly. "You spoke up when it mattered most. That took more courage than anything I've ever done." She smiled then, a real smile, fragile but genuine, and handed him the folded piece of paper. He opened it carefully. Inside was a crayon drawing of a girl and a dog, standing side by side beneath a bright yellow sun. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, were 4 words that made his throat tighten. "Briggs is my hero." Trent folded the paper and tucked it into his vest pocket, right over his heart. He looked down at Briggs, who was still gazing at Sadie with those calm, knowing eyes. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, that some bonds couldn't be explained by training or instinct alone. Sometimes, the ones who needed saving found the ones who could save them. And sometimes, a dog just knew.